The evening air in Boston, Massachusetts, carried a sharp, crisp breeze off the Charles River, but inside the grand, illuminated academic auditorium, the atmosphere was thick with warmth, expensive perfumes, and the hum of high society celebration. Henry stepped through the heavy oak entrance doors with his new lover Chloe, tightly gripping his arm, his posture radiating calculated triumph, as if daring anyone to question the path he had chosen. He navigated the crowded main aisle with deliberate stride, moving with the unearned confidence of a man who believed the universe belonged to him. His charcoal gray tailored suit caught the amber glow of the chandeliers, while the potent notes of his expensive cologne arrived at every table before his face came into focus. Beside him walked Chloe, 26, with long, lustrous dark hair cascading over her bare shoulders in a striking crimson silk dress that left no doubt of her desire to be the center of attention. She laughed softly at his whispered remark, tilting her head back in graceful, practiced elegance. The gathered guests stared openly, for it was impossible not to notice a spectacle so loud and provocative in a setting reserved for quiet intellectual achievements. This was the prestigious civil engineering doctoral graduation gala, a monumental milestone Henry had pursued relentlessly for 6 grueling years. Yet on this definitive night of validation, he had made a conscious, ruthless decision about whom he would bring to sit by his side. Upon reaching his reserved table near the front, Henry extended his arm with theatrical flourish to pull out Chloe's chair, ensuring the gesture was visible to the entire room, before scanning faces with a smug, self-satisfied smile. It was not an expression of genuine academic joy or humble gratitude. It was the cold look of a man declaring personal victory over his past, unbothered by the trail of broken promises. Professor Michael, the distinguished chairman of the department and Henry's primary dissertation advisor for 6 years, walked slowly toward the table, with measured, dignified pace. He possessed a deep, resonant voice and commanding presence that commanded respect without demanding it, his eyes carrying institutional wisdom and quiet moral clarity. He extended his hand, gripping Henry's with a firm squeeze, offering congratulations in a tone perfectly polite, yet devoid of warmth. His gaze drifted briefly to acknowledge Chloe before returning to Henry, leaving a heavy, unspoken question in the air. Sensing the tension, Henry seized the moment with breezy indifference, gesturing toward Chloe as if introducing a prize trophy. He introduced her, then casually announced that he and Lily had permanently separated several months ago, adding with a shallow shrug that life must go on. The words left his mouth with terrifying lightness, disrespecting the gravity of a decade of marriage. Professor Michael merely nodded in a slow, non-committal gesture, refusing to smile or extend his hand to Chloe, offering only a brief, formal excuse before walking away with quiet, unshakable dignity. Henry either failed to notice or chose to ignore the professor's icy demeanor, too consumed by vanity and his desire to remain the focal point of the evening. The surrounding tables noticed everything, however, and a suffocating wave of collective discomfort rippled outward. A younger female professor leaned over to whisper anxiously to her husband, while a senior colleague who had known Lily for years stared at the new couple longer than etiquette allowed, eyes filled with quiet disapproval. The atmosphere over that section was no longer festive celebration, but dense, palpable awkwardness, masked by polite nods and artificial glass clinking. Chloe, despite outward confidence, began to feel the pressure of the room's silent judgment, casting a discreet glance around as alienation took root. She attempted to smile warmly at a distinguished faculty member passing by, but received only a stiff, mechanical smile that never reached the eyes. Realizing the room was withholding genuine approval, Chloe turned back to Henry, who was already standing to greet another group of influential guests, oblivious to the silent rejection brewing around him. On the exact opposite side of Boston, inside a modest 5th-floor apartment Lily had hastily rented after leaving their family home, the space was entirely silent, save for distant city traffic. She was lying quietly on her worn fabric sofa in the dark, when her smartphone vibrated with an unfamiliar number, displaying a single, haunting sentence. She should be there tonight. Lily stared blankly at the glowing words as the clock crept past 8. She had spent the entire day forcing herself to perform mundane tasks in a desperate attempt to anchor her drifting mind. Washing dishes, trying to read a textbook, watching half of a television episode she could not remember. The fragile veneer of normalcy felt fraudulent, because she knew with absolute certainty that Henry's graduation gala was happening at that exact moment. She had lived every day of the past 6 years alongside his massive engineering dissertation, meticulously revising dense paragraphs whenever he begged for her intellect, brewing endless pots of black coffee during lonely dark hours, and holding his trembling hands on the days he swore he was going to quit. 2 years ago, when the academic committee ruthlessly rejected his 3rd chapter and Henry returned home destroyed and weeping, she was the one who rebuilt his confidence piece by piece, investing her soul into his success. Now he was standing in a brilliant ballroom with another woman, making sure the entire world saw him do it. Lily slowly lowered the phone onto her chest and stared up at the cracked plaster of the ceiling, remembering with painful clarity how he had walked into their kitchen on a random Wednesday night 4 months ago to coldly declare he no longer loved her. It had not been an emotional, explosive argument, but a chilling, premeditated speech, delivered with clinical precision. He had claimed he hadn't been happy for a long time and needed to be honest, leaving her trapped in paralyzing silence as the foundation of her life vanished. In the agonizing days that followed, the brutal details of his infidelity surfaced. A forgotten photograph, a recurring name in messages, revealing Chloe had been a constant fixture long before that night. Lily had discovered the betrayal on her own, processing the immense grief in absolute silence without causing a public scene, because that quiet reserve was who she had always been. Yet that very dignity had slowly transformed into a suffocating psychological prison over the last few months, her silence invaded by uninvited voices of well-meaning friends and relatives. Her sister-in-law had remarked, during an uncomfortable phone call, that the couple hadn't exactly looked happy recently anyway, as if temporary marital unhappiness justified profound betrayal. A mutual friend had suggested people simply grow in different directions, treating deliberate deception as an organic, blameless process. Even a female colleague at her research institute had commented with artificial kindness that Chloe was certainly very different, more expressive and lively, before adding she meant no offense. The worst part was not the words but the crushing reality that nobody in her life was actively standing up to defend her honor. Lily had quietly swallowed every agonizing phrase, wearing a polite, hollow mask, repeating that she was doing perfectly fine until the words lost meaning. Inside her soul, there were dark days when simply lifting her body out of bed felt impossible, consumed by a toxic internal voice, whispering she truly wasn't enough. She had stopped attending professional networking events, canceled speaking engagements, and physically shrunk her presence, leaving her brilliant public health research project abandoned on her computer screen for weeks. Lily looked down at the anonymous text message once more, and a sudden, unexpected shift occurred deep within her consciousness. It was not a burst of hot anger or reckless impulse for revenge, but a quiet, profound internal awakening, like a tiny resilient ember that had stayed alive beneath heavy ash, waiting for the right moment to catch fire. She began to think deeply about the brilliant, accomplished woman she had been, before shrinking into the shadows of Henry's betrayal. Remembering prestigious national conferences where she stood before intimidating scholars, answering difficult research questions without tremor in her voice. Her comprehensive public health reports officially adopted by municipal health departments to save lives. The countless times she had walked into a room knowing her intellect had something valuable to offer the world. She questioned why she was hiding in this cramped, dark apartment, swallowing shame that did not belong to her, while the man who shattered their vows paraded his new life without a shred of guilt. The realization was not an urge to hurt him, but a firm declaration that she had finally reached her absolute limit with playing the victim in someone else's narrative. She picked up her phone with a steady hand and dialed a familiar number. Her loyal friend Maya answered on the second ring. Their bond, the rare kind of sisterhood that survived years of separate lives and long silences without losing its core strength. When the separation first occurred, Maya had tried calling 3 times in 1 week. Though Lily let them go to voicemail, Maya never stopped sending small text messages, voice notes, and quotes to keep a light on for her. Lily spoke simply that she needed her friend right now, and Maya, recognizing the weight behind those words, did not ask a single question before promising she was on her way. Within 40 minutes, Maya was in the small kitchen brewing chamomile tea, listening intently as Lily poured out her soul about the text message, the grand gala, and the internal voice that had spent months convincing her she was inadequate. Maya listened without interruption, refusing to offer cheap solutions before fully understanding the depth of her friend's emotional landscape. When Lily finally stopped speaking, a short, heavy silence filled the kitchen before Maya looked her directly in the eyes and asked if she truly wanted to go to the auditorium tonight. Lily looked down at her hands wrapped around the warm mug, whispering that she genuinely did not know if she possessed the courage. Maya immediately leaned forward, her voice ringing with certainty, telling Lily she was entirely capable, that this journey had nothing to do with Henry. She explained with fierce precision that this was about Lily refusing to live inside the diminished, broken version of herself Henry had created to justify his sins, cutting through months of self-doubt with a truth that was both painful and liberating. The transformation that took place over the next hour was devoid of cheap Hollywood glamour, which made the process feel more powerful and grounded in reality. Maya walked into Lily's quiet bedroom with the calm, unstoppable determination of a true friend who refused to accept any more easy excuses. She flung open the heavy wooden wardrobe doors and began inspecting the clothes with intense focus, while Lily stood near the doorway with arms tightly crossed, defensively protecting herself from an influx of hope she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. Tucked away in the very back hung a deep navy blue dress of exceptionally high-quality fabric that draped beautifully, a garment Lily had purchased 2 years ago for an international academic symposium and had only worn once. It was not a flashy party dress, but the exquisite type some would call perfectly understated and others deeply elegant, depending on the woman wearing it. Maya removed the hanger without a word and gently extended it toward Lily, who stared at the rich fabric for a long, quiet moment before silently taking it and walking into the bathroom. When she finally stepped in front of the mirror, the woman looking back felt simultaneously familiar and like an incredible stranger. Her classic features, dark brown eyes, and soft wavy hair pulled up into a sophisticated clean bun, accentuating the natural elegant lines of her jaw. There was a profound shift in her reflection, an unmistakable essence of self-awareness, returning from whatever dark hiding place it had been buried in for the last 4 months. It was not shallow vanity or a desire to perform for others, but the quiet, solid consciousness of a woman finally choosing to be fully present inside her own skin again. She had spent months existing as if trapped behind a thick pane of frosted glass, dully watching her own life pass by from an agonizing distance. But now that glass had shattered into 1,000 pieces. She remained in front of the mirror for several minutes without urgency, allowing her mind to reacquaint itself with the true depth of her own countenance, until Maya appeared quietly in the doorway, asking softly if she was ready to step out. Throughout the drive across the city in Maya's car, with the window lowered just enough to let cool night air brush her face, Lily remained entirely silent. But it was no longer the heavy silence of paralyzing anxiety. It was the focused, organizing silence of a person gathering internal forces before stepping into a great battle, reminding herself precisely why this difficult act of courage was necessary for her survival. She knew she was not driving toward the auditorium to enact petty dramatic revenge, a realization she maintained with absolute internal honesty. Revenge possessed a hot, volatile flavor she wanted no part of. What she felt tonight was a cool, unyielding refusal to continue playing the submissive role the community's gossip had assigned her. She was completely done being the abandoned wife, the inadequate woman left behind in the dark, and she was officially stepping out of the script written for her. The massive academic auditorium was operating at maximum capacity by the time Maya steered her car into a vacant spot in the crowded, well-lit parking lot. Warm, golden light flooded through the expansive glass windows, accompanied by muffled rhythmic sounds of a live jazz band and the sleek alignment of hundreds of luxury vehicles. Lily sat perfectly still in the passenger seat for a long moment before opening her door, her heart beating with steady, powerful rhythm, as Maya placed a reassuring hand on her forearm without a word. Lily drew in one deep, deliberate breath, expanding her lungs with cool night air, before stepping out onto the asphalt and smoothing the fabric of her navy blue dress. She walked toward the grand entrance with measured, unhurried steps, containing no visible urgency or physical tension, carrying herself with that rare quality of natural presence that only belongs to someone who has stopped trying to please the world. The senior security officer at the main entrance recognized her face instantly, his professional expression shifting from standard vigilance to profound respect as he stepped aside, greeting her formally as Dr. Lily. She offered a gracious nod and passed through the threshold, the heavy double doors swinging open to reveal the brilliant expanse of the gala inside. What occurred next is difficult to describe without diminishing the sheer understated gravity of the moment, because there were no dramatic sound effects, no loud scenes, no theatrical gestures. It was simply Lily walking into the room, yet her mere presence possessed a heavy, undeniable reality that completely captivated the attention of everyone who looked her way. She entered through a long side corridor, opening directly onto the main floor, where circular banquet tables were arranged in a magnificent grand semicircle around the elevated presentation stage. The formal event had been underway for a little over an hour, and the moment a senior faculty member caught sight of her, a silent chain reaction began to propagate through the massive ballroom like wildfire. One guest lowered their crystal glass to the linen tablecloth, another turned their head sharply, and a third whispered urgently to their companion, until a wave of absolute silence rapidly expanded across the entire hall. A respected older female professor stopped mid-sentence to stare, and a former doctoral colleague standing with his back to the entrance turned around the moment he noticed the sudden unexplained drop in conversation. A woman seated near the main stage carefully placed her champagne flute down without breaking her gaze. Nobody called out her name or made an overt gesture, yet the entire room felt her presence with immediate, undeniable clarity. Lily was approximately 15 meters away from Henry when she finally came to a halt, while he was still standing with his back completely turned to the entrance, deeply engaged in jovial conversation with a small group of influential civil engineering colleagues. Chloe stood closely by his side, her hand resting comfortably on his tailored sleeve, with the absolute assurance of a woman who believed she had firmly secured her rightful place at the top of his world. One of the men in Henry's circle happened to look past his shoulder, freezing mid-sentence, as his eyes locked onto Lily with a complex mixture of immediate recognition and unscripted admiration. Sensing the sudden awkward paralysis of his colleague, Henry began to turn his head to see what had caused the disruption, and the expression on his face transformed instantly into a mask of pure shock and intense discomfort. Beneath that initial layer of panic, a deeply buried look of late, agonizing realization began to surface in his eyes. The terrible kind of understanding that hurts precisely because it arrives long after it can do any good. He stood completely frozen, his mouth slightly open but empty of words, while Chloe grew remarkably quiet beside him, as she observed the profound shift in his demeanor. Chloe's gaze darted between Henry's pale face and the magnificent woman who had just entered, and what she discovered did not match the narrative she had been fed for the past several months. During secret nights, Henry had spent whispering about his marriage. He had meticulously constructed a specific image of Lily as a cold, distant, overly academic, and deeply ordinary woman who lacked the vibrant spark he required to succeed. Yet the statuesque, profoundly elegant woman standing across the auditorium defied every line of that convenient lie, causing Chloe to withdraw into a tense, watchful silence. Lily did not look toward either of them long enough to grant the satisfaction of a scene, completely bypassing their table as she calmly walked toward a quiet seating area where Maya had secured 2 vacant chairs. She sat down gracefully, requested a glass of water from a passing waiter, placed her small clutch bag against the backrest of her chair, and focused her eyes forward on the stage, as if the entire ballroom were her natural domain. The shift in the room's energy was gradual, but entirely real, as scholars and colleagues who had spent years working alongside her began to cross the floor to greet her with a warmth that felt like a collective sigh of relief. Professor Michael himself walked directly across the crowded room the moment he spotted her, grasping her hand with both of his in a long, meaningful gesture that extended far beyond standard professional courtesy. He looked at her with immense sincerity, expressing how profoundly grateful he was that she had chosen to attend tonight, whispering that there was something of immense importance taking place that she absolutely needed to hear. Over at Henry's table, the social atmosphere had grown incredibly cold, in a way he was desperately struggling to comprehend or navigate as the evening progressed. The influential group of colleagues he had been laughing with just moments before had quietly dispersed without real explanation, leaving him standing in a rapidly clearing circle. A senior peer who had been exceptionally warm and complimentary upon his arrival could now barely maintain direct eye contact, offering a brief excuse before walking away toward the opposite side of the hall. Whenever Henry attempted to initiate conversation with nearby guests, the responses were incredibly short, perfectly polite, but entirely distant, a subtle wall of disapproval impossible to actively fight against. It was the devastating silence of a community that had collectively formed a definitive moral opinion about his character, leaving him with nothing left to prove and no way to salvage his pristine reputation. Chloe watched him with a sharp, discerning eye as he returned to his seat, having always been skilled at reading the unspoken dynamics of a room. The environment was communicating a powerful truth without a single spoken word, making it abundantly clear that the self-serving story Henry had spun about his past was a fiction nobody in this room actually believed. The definitive moment when the entire trajectory of the evening shifted occurred when Professor Michael quietly requested the microphone from the Master of Ceremonies and stepped onto the stage completely outside the pre-planned schedule. A curious murmur of speculation rippled through the hundreds of guests as the elder professor stood before the microphone, carrying the heavy, natural authority of a man who had earned absolute respect of the academic community over 4 decades. He began speaking in a slow, measured cadence, his powerful voice filling every corner of the silent hall, as he announced that before concluding the formal proceedings, he felt compelled to make a public recognition that was long overdue. The entire auditorium became perfectly still, the clinking of silverware vanishing entirely as the crowd focused on the stage. He reminded the audience of the integrated primary care protocol that had been successfully implemented across 14 major municipalities in the state during the previous calendar year. He paused deliberately, letting the silence stretch, before stating that this revolutionary protocol had successfully reduced avoidable hospitalizations among vulnerable populations by a staggering 38% during its very first phase of implementation, directly transforming the lives of 82,000 people. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and heavy, as Professor Michael explained that this monumental breakthrough had actually begun as an entirely independent, unfunded research initiative that required 4 years of relentless labor. He detailed how the project had survived 3 separate, devastating rejections from major grant funding committees, before finally receiving approval, facing immense institutional resistance at least two critical junctures where any ordinary researcher would have quit with good reason. He paused once more, his eyes sweeping across the gathered crowd, before locking directly onto the quiet table, where Lily was seated next to Maya, his voice rising with immense pride, as he revealed that this entire life-saving operation was conducted by a scholar who never once sought the spotlight or demanded public credit in spaces like this grand hall. He explained that she had simply done the grueling work because she believed with all her heart that it was necessary, before looking directly at her and asking Dr. Lily to please stand up and be recognized by her peers. Lily remained completely frozen in her chair for a single, breathless second, her mind struggling to process the sudden weight of the moment, until Maya gently placed a reassuring hand on her knee, whispering fiercely for her to stand up. As she slowly rose to her feet, the entire auditorium turned as one cohesive unit to face her, the room remaining perfectly quiet for a fraction of a second before erupting into a deafening, thunderous wave of applause that shook the very air. It was the kind of deep, emotional ovation that occurs when people need a moment to fully process the sheer magnitude of what they are witnessing, as if their hearts had to align themselves before their hands could begin to clap. Lily stood tall, her fingers gently clasped in front of her navy blue dress, her posture entirely devoid of shallow pride or performative modesty. She was simply a woman standing in the truth of her own magnificent achievements, letting the collective appreciation wash over her tired body. Professor Michael raised his hand to gently quiet the applause, stating that he needed to share one final, deeply personal truth with the room regarding this extraordinary research project. He explained that this monumental work was entirely completed over the past 2 years, running in perfect parallel with an incredibly difficult period of personal hardship and emotional upheaval in this woman's private life. He looked around the room, noting that she never once asked for a lighter workload, never begged to be spared from her duties, and never allowed her scientific standards to diminish when her personal universe was fracturing around her. He stated with profound conviction that when a human being possesses a true, divine vocation, personal suffering cannot erase the work. Instead, the pain often causes the depth of the work to grow into something magnificent. One of the senior female professors seated at the very front table was openly wiping away tears as Professor Michael revealed that when they discovered Lily might not attend tonight, they made a deliberate choice to ensure someone urged her to be here, because this grand recognition belonged entirely to her. He extended a deep, respectful bow of his head toward Lily, offering his profound thanks on behalf of the entire university community, which ignited an even more powerful, emotional standing ovation from every corner of the room. Lily slowly returned to her seat, her hands trembling slightly against the linen napkin, not from nervous fear, but from the overwhelming somatic experience of a massive truth finally being brought into the light. Maya immediately reached over to clasp her hand tightly, whispering into her ear that 82,000 human lives had been directly touched by her intellect, causing Lily to close her eyes as a single tear escaped down her cheek. She had forced herself to sit at her computer during the darkest, most agonizing months of her life, pulling herself out of bed when her limbs felt like lead and her internal thoughts screamed that she was completely worthless. She had spent the lonely hours of the morning typing through swollen, tear-stained eyes, sending hundreds of ignored emails to stubborn municipal health administrators, refusing to give up not because she felt strong, but because the human beings relying on her research desperately needed the work to be finished. Now, inside this brilliant hall of scholars, those 82,000 people possessed a protective shield that was forged entirely by her hands, permanently binding her name to a legacy of genuine human survival. In the distant corner of the ballroom, Henry stood entirely alone near the polished mahogany bar, a crystal glass clutched tightly in his hand that he had completely forgotten to drink from as his mind replayed every word of the professor's speech. The 14 municipalities, the 38% reduction, the 82,000 lives, and the 4 years of silent sacrifice began to piece together a terrifyingly accurate portrait of the extraordinary woman he had lived beside for years without ever truly seeing. Lily had accomplished this world-changing feat while sharing his home, while he was busy dismissing her as emotionally distant, complaining that she was trapped in her own little world, and explicitly telling her that her public health work lacked the practical, high-earning relevance of his civil engineering career. He had looked at her deep, unwavering commitment to a higher calling and foolishly labeled it as coldness, mistaking her profound intellectual depth for emotional absence, before turning his back on her to chase a shallow, comfortable reflection of his own ego. The sudden realization of his monumental ignorance was completely insupportable, settling into Henry's chest like a heavy, suffocating weight as he stood in the shadows of the brilliant ballroom. Chloe stepped up beside him, a profound, icy silence stretching between them that was entirely different from the playful, flirtatious energy they had shared at the start of the evening. She looked at him with an incredibly sharp, evaluating gaze, asking him in a quiet, piercing whisper if he had honestly known about the true scale of Lily's professional research. Henry remained entirely silent, his eyes fixed on the floor as Chloe noted with an analytical tone that he had lived in the same house with this woman while she was quietly changing the world. She pointed out that he had constantly described his wife as a dull, ordinary, and emotionally freezing person who was incapable of meeting his dynamic needs. Yet she was looking at a savior of 82,000 people. She stated with devastating clarity that he had been standing right next to a woman of historic brilliance, and somehow felt she wasn't enough for his ego, asking him what that reality truly revealed about his own character. Henry found himself utterly incapable of producing a response, and Chloe did not bother waiting for a lie, her expression hardening as she realized there was no honorable answer he could ever give to salvage his dignity. A young female graduate student of about 25 years old, named Isabella, walked nervously over to Lily's table, with her eyes shining with immense admiration, her short hair and bright expression reflecting a deep, emotional urgency. Isabella confessed that she had read Lily's published paper during her second semester of her master's program, when she was completely overwhelmed and planning to permanently drop out of academia. She paused for a brief second to catch her breath, looking directly into Lily's eyes as she stated that that specific article was the exact reason she found the strength to stay in school and finish her degree. Lily looked up at the young student with a beautiful, genuine warmth that contained absolutely no performative modesty, asking for her name before offering a sincere thank you for sharing such a profound personal story. Isabella's eyes welled with tears as she offered a final nod of gratitude, turning quickly to disappear into the crowd before her emotions could overwhelm her in public. As the grand academic gala finally began to draw to a close, with the large crowd thinning out and the catering staff quietly clearing away the empty crystal glasses, Henry found himself wandering aimlessly near the back exit of the facility. He stood near the service counter for a very long time, staring blankly at the perfectly arranged rows of glass bottles behind the bar without actually registering their shapes or labels. The head bartender, a wise, weathered older man with gray hair who had spent decades quietly observing the hidden dramas of high society events from behind his counter, began wiping down the surface with a clean cloth. Without looking up from his work, the old man remarked in a casual tone that it had been an incredibly beautiful ceremony tonight, specifically pointing out the magnificent achievement of that brilliant female public health researcher. Henry offered a tight, forced nod of his head, his throat dry as the bartender continued, mentioning that his own daughter worked as a registered nurse in one of the small rural municipalities that had officially adopted Lily's primary care protocol. The older man paused, shaking his head with a look of deep reverence, as he stated that his daughter constantly talked about how that single piece of research had completely revolutionized the way they protect the health of poor, struggling families. He looked up, his ancient eyes locking onto Henry's face with a devastatingly simple observation, noting that sometimes humans have absolutely no idea what kind of greatness is walking right beside them while life passes by. The words were not delivered as an intentional insult or aggressive accusation, but rather as the simple, grounded truth of an old man who had learned to call things by their proper names. Yet they struck Henry's conscience with the force of a physical blow. Henry stood perfectly paralyzed as the final groups of guests began to say their goodbyes, and as fate would have it, he encountered Lily standing near the main coat check area near the exit doors. They came to a sudden halt, a mere 2 meters apart from one another. A vast, unbridgeable chasm of history and broken trust separating their bodies in the quiet corridor. At that exact moment, Professor Michael appeared naturally from the ballroom, walking toward the exit with his briefcase in hand, stopping dead in his tracks as he noticed the two former spouses standing face to face. He directed a brief, heavy glance toward Henry that communicated a lifetime of silent understanding and absolute disappointment, before turning his full, warm attention squarely toward Lily. He spoke in a steady, resonant voice, stating that there was one critical thing he should have confessed to her exactly 2 years ago when she first delivered her preliminary project proposal to his office. He took a slow breath, admitting openly that when he had looked at her initial drafts and told her that her goals were far too ambitious for a single researcher to achieve, he was completely and utterly wrong. He smiled with a profound, peer-to-peer respect, stating that he was incredibly glad she possessed the fierce independence of mind to completely ignore his administrative doubts. Lily stood in her quiet dignity, offering a soft, appreciative smile as she replied that she had listened to his guidance just enough to refine the structure of the project, but never enough to let him stop her from fulfilling her mission. Professor Michael chuckled softly, nodding his head in absolute agreement before offering a final, respectful farewell and walking out into the cool evening air. Henry had stood there and listened to every single word of that brief, devastating exchange, his mind automatically calculating the timeline with agonizing precision. 2 years ago, when Lily was fighting to protect that ambitious protocol against the doubts of the university's highest authorities, they were still sharing the same bed and living under the same roof. She had been quietly carrying the massive weight of a world-changing project on her shoulders, while he was busy coming home every night to complain about her emotional distance, selfishly demanding more of her energy, while secretly seeking validation in the arms of another woman. Lily turned her calm, steady gaze onto Henry, looking at his pale, trembling face with a profound serenity that contained absolutely no trace of hot anger or bitter resentment. She had traversed the deepest valleys of emotional devastation over the past 4 months, crying until her eyes were dry, and she had finally arrived at a spiritual destination where hatred simply had no room to exist, because her soul was completely filled with far better things. Henry opened his mouth in a desperate attempt to form a sentence, to offer an apology, or to construct a convenient explanation that could somehow bridge the immense distance between them. But his voice completely failed him. There was no phrase in the human language large enough to cover the massive betrayal of what he had done, and no excuse that could survive the brilliant light of the woman standing before him. Lily waited a fraction of a second, her expression perfectly peaceful, before offering a small, dignified nod of her head, a gesture packed with an enormity of closure, and walked gracefully through the glass exit doors, without ever looking back. Outside, under the brilliant blanket of the Massachusetts sky, Maya was waiting patiently, leaning against her car, as the crisp, clean night air swirled around the concrete courtyard. Lily came to a brief halt on the sidewalk, looking up at the rare stars that managed to pierce through the city's electric glow, feeling the immense weight of the last few months finally lifting from her chest. She remembered the intense shame she had wrongly carried, the suffocating silences she had misidentified as permanent defeat, and the brutal nights spent believing she was fundamentally inadequate. None of her magnificent scientific achievements had ever required Henry's shallow approval, and none of the 82,000 lives she had saved had ever cared about the distorted, diminished version of herself he had tried to force her into. She had survived the storm by simply doing the work, by protecting her intellect in the dark, and by completely refusing to allow a dishonest man to dictate the true measure of her worth. Maya stepped up beside her, wrapping a warm, supportive arm around her shoulders, as she softly asked how she was feeling inside her heart. Lily remained quiet for a long, beautiful moment, watching her breath mist in the cool air, before offering a smile that was completely whole, stating simply and honestly that she had finally returned to herself. Henry remained standing in the dark, empty parking lot, long after the final headlights had vanished down the avenue, Chloe having called her own ride home hours earlier, without saying goodbye. He sat alone in his vehicle with the ignition turned off, bearing the crushing, permanent weight of his own calculated choices, as the cold reality settled into his bones that he had lost a queen without ever understanding the true depth of the woman who had walked beside him. Later that night, inside her quiet apartment, Lily flipped open her laptop, her fingers hovering over the public health manuscript that had sat abandoned for months, reading the final lines she had written with a fresh sense of wonder. She realized they were profoundly good, and as she began to type her next paragraph into the quiet hours of the morning, she knew that the true measure of a human life is never determined by those who abandon us, but by the quiet resilience we choose to cultivate when the world thinks we are broken. Every human journey eventually encounters a season of profound testing, a quiet midnight hour, where structures built over decades are fractured by the thoughtless actions of those trusted most. For those who have walked long enough upon this earth, the true measure of a soul is never found in loud, performative victories under fleeting spotlights, but in the silent, unyielding dignity maintained when the foundation crumbles beneath our feet. True worth is an internal sanctuary, forged through years of quiet duty, honest labor, and unsung sacrifices that shallow minds will never fully comprehend. When unjustly cast into the shadows of betrayal, the instinct screams for loud confrontation or vengeance to prove our value to a crowd never invested in our truth. Yet the highest maturity lies in the cool refusal to participate in petty scripts written by detractors, choosing instead to let silent, purposeful labor become the ultimate testament to character. There is enduring strength in one who refuses to let agony sour into bitterness, in turning a broken heart into healing for thousands they may never meet. We must stop seeking validation from those who lack the capacity to understand the depth of our devotion, realizing their inability to see our worth reflects their own blindness, not our insufficiency. The grandest achievements of a mature life are born in quiet resilience, where we choose to do what is right simply because it is our calling, independent of applause. As illusions of superficial status fade like mist in morning sun, only the solid bedrock of character remains. Let your life be a sanctuary of quiet excellence, a reminder that the true light within an honorable spirit can never be extinguished by deception. When you stand in the clear space of self-reclamation, you realize you never needed their permission to be magnificent. You have already returned to who you were always meant to be.